Okay, we should start. So today we're going to go finally to hierarchical model, but before we jump straight into that, how are things going with your assignment? Are there some stumbling blocks, things that you would want to get clarified? Yes. Yep.
Right now, we can only cover the alphabet is 0.57.
Okay.
I don't know. So it seems kind of weird.
That you can only do that in that range, yeah. So I guess tomorrow we can have a look at the model, yeah. Yeah, so it doesn't need to work per se, but I want to see a honest attempt at making it work. Right. Yeah. There's not going to be a ground for failure, but I want to see that you actually tried to make it work, right? That you found a problem and then did something. Are you all fine with the model quality checks? You get the gist? You check the course notes and it all makes perfect sense. It's so beautiful. Is it so opaque that you don't even know what to ask?
None of us now prove it. Yeah, just spit it out.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Yes, but you should know that whenever a question comes up, you should figure out a way to ask it, right? So it's in class or in lectures or yes.
We were discussing that just before the serial update check.
Yes.
Is this just our check overlay without serial?
Yes, and when you're simulating data, also with a true value, so you get a good idea of what's going on. Yeah. Yeah, it's really to see to get a qualitative idea of how much the prior is constraining the posterior and how much the posterior has been able to learn, in the sense that you can see that the more peaked it is compared to the prior, the more it has learned. And we have more systematic ways of doing that, like the prior sensitivity, but they're not as intuitive as that check. Plus, it's going to become even more crucial when we get to empirical data. Okay. So the idea is that we wrapped up formalizing, simulating, inferring, and assessing one-agent models. However, experiment and data sets often have a more complex structure than what we've seen so far, right? So the idea is that now we want to learn how instead we tell the model that there is a structure. We'll see what that structure is, but basically if you have 10 participants, right? We expect these 10 participants to share something, but to also be a bit different from each other. If you're running an experiment with stimuli, right? We all know that stimuli, the specific stimulus can have a big impact on the results of our experiments. So we want to tell the model that there are different stimuli that perhaps are repeated across participants. So I try to call it hierarchical modeling, but you've met it probably as mixed effect modeling, multi-level modeling. There's a million different terms for this. I like hierarchical because it has this idea of the structure of the data, while mixed effect always ends up confusing everybody. Right? What's random, what's fixed? we'll see that we actually just want to tell the model whether the elements in a structure, let's say the participants or the diagnostic groups or the experimental condition, share variance or not. If they share variance, we can pull them together, and usually we call that random effects. If they don't share variance, is what we usually call the fixed effects. But we actually want to go beyond the label and just think through which things share variance and which don't. So as I was saying, the parameters we estimate in a hierarchical model have a structure, meaning that when we run our experiment, we expect that the learning rate across participants is different. So we have an individual level of description, but also that all these participants are fundamentally human and share something together, right? Which means that we might also try to estimate the population level parameter. So think of it in saying when you run an experiment, you want to know, oh, do people, when their external environment change also their learning rate? You don't care as much about the individuals, right? You want to know whether your experimental manipulation or your observed quasi-natural manipulation has an effect on the average behavior, right? But then you can also go and say, well, what determines whether one specific individual changes their learning rate or not? And therefore, you have these two layers that can be modeled at the same time. If you're running a meta-analysis, right, you might have that individual studies have their peculiarities, so they might be different from each other, but they also hopefully share a general effect, right? But you might also have that different studies are run by the same research group, which means that they will share variance at an intermediate level. And then you have the population level estimate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we want to make it very concrete with a very abstract diagram, I'm just going to turn off the light. Yes. All right, so what we have here is our biased agent model, where we have some observed discrete choices, right, which are assumed to be generated by an unobserved rate of picking right, our theta, which is continuous, so it has a white background, and sorry, it's unobserved, so it has a white background, and it is continuous, so it's a circle. And we want to see how do we put concretely the structure in these models, right? So the first thing is we have a bunch of trials, but that doesn't really change our model. The second thing is that we have a bunch of subjects. Right? So we say that these model in which an underlying theta is generating at each trial some choices is repeated at the level of the subject. So if we look carefully at these model, we are saying something very specific. So we are saying that the choice might change according to trial and individual. But we are also saying that theta is not changing. Right? There is one overall theta. So there is an inner rate that is generating all the choices of all the specific participants in all the specific trials. Right? In this case, what we would say, and I'm anticipating some of the slides, is that this is what we call a full pooling model. We assume that all the data are pointing us to one parameter. That the theta value, the rate, doesn't change across participants. Yes?
I mean, you're probably going to comment on this data, but this in cognitive modeling, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
No.
Right? Okay, good.
No.
Yeah.
And it probably, actually, it's going to break your model. Yes. Okay. It's not going to fit, most likely. I'm just going through the assumptions that we're putting in. Yes. All right. So what we can do to assuage Christian's out is actually we might say that the theta is different by individual, right? So that each individual has their own tendency to pick right. So we put an I subscript on the theta to signal that each subject has a different one. This is, yes?
Is that not just implied by having it within the box for subjects?
No, because we could imagine that all the subjects fit into the same parameter.
Okay, so you have to explicitly.
Yes, and I'm doing this because then we can actually build those specific models and compare their performance on our data, right? Yeah. So it's when we do formal things, it's best to be explicit. So what this model is saying is that while they share the general mechanism that produces the choices, each participant has a completely independent theta from everybody else. It's what I don't know if you've done it in method 3, but this is what is called the no pooling model, meaning that there is no sharing of information across participants. Right? Here was full pooling. All the participants' information go into the same box. Here, there's no pooling. It's the equivalent of fitting your model separately to each of the participants individually. Does that make sense? Have you done it in method 3? Do you remember it from method 3? Yes.
I think we did it in method 4.
Okay.
I think remember that is covered in one of the models at Avicia.
Yes. Yeah, so it's this one. The no pooling model has amnesia because every time it starts analyzing a new participant, it hasn't learned anything about the previous participants. Yeah. And this one is the pathological memory because it cannot sort of forget what happened before, and that might be a problem because new participants might be different. And I'm saying new, the model estimates all of them at the same time, but it's just to say there is no leakage of information from one participant to the other. So what's missing from this picture? Yes.
I need a compromise from 3 and 2.
Yes. Can you elaborate?
Yes. I think we also saw something like, maybe exactly the same position, where we assume there's this like relation level data, and then we sample and get the exact structure, but either you sample directly from that, or you sample offsets to it some way.
Yeah, we'll see that. So basically, the whole idea is that we are going from there is just one population and no participants, no individual identity in the participants, to the participants are monads that never communicate to each other. We need something in between where each participant is identified as an individual, but all of these participants belong to the same population, and therefore what we learn from the other participant can shape how we make inference on this participant. Right, so when you meet a new person, you don't need to create from scratch a whole mental representation of what a human being is, what a young person is, of that specific gender, et cetera, right? You rely on a bunch of pre-established knowledge, and then you're willing to sort of adjust it to the person you're knowing. So what we can do is we can say that those theta i's, the rates of the single individuals, are generated according to an underlying distribution at the population level, which for simplicity has two parameters, a mean and a standard deviation. And so basically that the choices there are generated by individual rates, but these individual rates do not live in the vacuum. They are generated by an underlying population level parameter. Right? And this is really what we're going to code. right? We're just telling it. We're just gonna tell it that the parameters that generate the observed behavior are generated according to another distribution. So in other words, right, if we go closer to what the code is, we have that any given choice at time t or trial t for participant I is generated according to a Bernoulli, which has a theta parameter I separated by individual. This theta I is generated according to a normal distribution, which has a given mean and a given standard deviation. And these population level mean and standard deviations, they have a prior. We could, in principle, go even higher. Let's imagine that we have 5 groups, right? 5 cohorts of cog-sci students. We could then put on top of the theta mean group and theta SD group the fact that they're sampled from theta mean cog-sci and theta mean theta SD cog-sci parameters, right? There's really nothing stopping us from putting different layers there. And that's the beauty of the Bayesian approach, that we just draw what we think the mechanism generating the data is, and then it solves it for us. Right? Okay, these were the pooling strategies. I've already discussed them. What if we have more than one parameter? Right. So for instance, the bad model that we've seen last week had 2 parameters, right? Bias and a beta, right? A general bias, no matter what the other is doing, and the impact of memory. So what we can do is that we have that in this case, the theta, the propensity to pick right, is not anymore an invariant parameter at the level of the individual, but it changes on a trial by trial basis as memory changes, right? So we put another subscript here with t. And then we say that that theta parameter is generated by the memory that we have and the 2 parameter bias I and beta I. And that these parameters, the bias I and the beta I, each come from their own population level distributions. Does that make sense? Yes, if we have the win-stay-lose shift, right, it's basically the same thing. So here we have the win beta, the lose beta, a potential bias. Each of them comes from a population level distribution. This is the reinforcement learning level model, right? We have a tau and an alpha. Each of them come from their own population level distribution. So technically, at this level, once you build, no matter your agent level model, making it into a multi-level or a hierarchical model is just a question of telling then, don't put a numeric prior on these parameters, because their prior is a population level parameter, if you want. Yes.
And Claes, I think, talked to us about it and made like an example to do with like, let's say we were like 2 classes, for example.
Yep.
We both, each class would have its own population level distributions, right?
Yes.
But in that case, like, let's say for class 1, they would have their own alpha and their own tau.
Yep.
Aren't the 2 then connected?
You can. So that's the beauty, that you can then actually put on top of those a further layer. So now you have individual level parameters, class level parameters, and cog-sci level parameters, if you want.
Where the alpha and the tau would then be set with cog-sci.
Exactly. Yes. So let's say you have here the alpha I that has alpha mean at the level of the class, and an alpha standard deviation at the level of the class. But these, the alpha mean at the level of the class, is not existing in a vacuum, right? It's generated by the alpha mean at the level of study, let's say, and an alpha sigma at the level of the study, of the education, right? And in principle, we could do the same with the sigma. We could say that the variability that is in a given class might be generated by the variability that we expect in the more general population of coxi students. We don't often do that unless we have questions about that, right?
But wouldn't the alpha and the tau also still be related at the class level because they're coming from the same population? I know they modeled as separate parameters.
Yes, okay, now I get it. So the point is, now we understood this hierarchical structure, like it's a vertical structure, but there is also a horizontal structure. So there are trade-offs between tau and alpha. And so here we have the tau, I think it's the other direction, the tau I, and the tau I will actually be, I don't know how to represent it as a variance covariance matrix. Beautiful. They might be correlated. And actually, we can also add that the tau at the level class will also be correlated by this beautiful variance covariance matrix, right? And where we stop, right, that's up to us, right? And up to the model when it doesn't fit anymore. I don't think that today we'll manage to get all the way to the correlation of random effects or these variance covariance correlations, but if not today, we're going to do them next week. Yes. So the sky is the limit. You can put as much complexity in the model as you want. It's going to have a hard time fitting or precisely estimated the parameters, the more complex it is, but you can actually get away with a lot of stuff in Bayesian stats. So I think I had a couple of years ago, I was working on this paper where we were looking at the cognitive abilities of adults with mental disorders and of their children, yet undiagnosed children. And so what we wanted to say is that there were these three groups, schizophrenia, bipolar, and controls, and that inside each individual, the child and the parent had their own cognitive model of how they were performing, that then the parameters of the child and the parent would be correlated in a way that was different by group, but also that could be conditioned where the covariance, covariance would be, no, it's actually here, I think, would be conditioned on, for instance, whether the parent lived with the child or not. And the model actually fit, but when I ran a precision/power analysis to see how many families we would need, it said that we needed like between 30 and 50,000 families. And so we sort of dropped it from the paper because what can you do, right? But the model actually fit the data. So we got estimate from the data. We just couldn't trust them. Yeah. Yes?
Is it always the case that the bias are on the top level of the hierarchy? What do you interpret that?
So the question is, if you have a parameter, and the parameter can be at any level, when do we put priors? And what you say prior is when we actually have a distribution that we define ourselves. And when do we use another parameter? Do we always get that only the top level parameter get these numeric distributions that we define. And the point is that when you have tau I, which is generated by this, that's the prior for this tau I. Right? If we add some numeric prior, then we're replacing the hyperparameter, population level parameter, however you want to call it. Yeah, so I'm always very skeptical in using hyper because, as you've seen, it can go many layers, right? So I like to say, well, the group level parameter or the population level parameter, that seems a bit better. But so basically what we're saying is that for each participant, we know something before we look at their data. That is what all the other participant parameters are. That's our prior when going and estimating that specific individual. And then when we get to the top layer, right, whatever the top layer is, let's say the population level here, well, here we don't have other parameters that can fit in. So there we need to put the priors because space always need a generating distribution. Yeah.
To do the prior tests or prior sensitivity, but then only iterate across values on the top level.
Yes.
Okay.
And then see how the effect cascades down. Because the beauty of these models is that I can estimate all the participants at once and their population in a way that is mathematically equivalent to me estimating all the participants, using that to generate the population level prior, and then using that as a prior to infer on a given participant. We're doing it all at once, thanks to Markov chain or Hamiltonian Monte Carlo explorations, right? Because when we're moving in the Hamiltonian posterior space, we're looking at all the parameters at the same time. So it might nudge us, they nudge us in different direction altogether. Yes?
Just a sanity check. So tau sub I,
Yes.
we don't sort of have that. It's inherited one.
We have that prior.
So that's-
Yes.
But then on the reference you put, I picked
Yeah.
Statistics, not for it.
Oh, yeah. So that's because other choice and choice fully determine feedback.
So statistics, okay.
Yeah. While these are generating probabilistically. Yeah.
Fully determined tau sub I. Is that a way that you mark that visually?
Yes, that's I didn't import it. That's this, right? You put them in their own plate with a separate background. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So, are there other questions on this kind of setup? Right? We have every individual, every unit that we're interested in has its own parameters. These parameters are not independent across units. Therefore, we constrain them by saying there is an overarching parameter at the level of the population from which we assume that all the individual level parameters are generated. Yes.
It's relating it to although I see that we are moving away from fixed random effects terminology,
Yeah.
I still think when you've been fitting models in ERMS, whatever, you use the lines to indicate.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the population level priors is actually saying what we are interested in estimating, which would be the fixed effect, right?
Well, so here let's say that we have a binomial choice that could be 1 or 0 or 1, like a choice. In the syntax you're talking about, we would have an overarching rate of picking right. And then we would see that that varies by ID, right? And we haven't defined it, so we're not at this stage asking a very specific research question. So whether we're mostly interested in the population level or in the individual level, it's undetermined.
Okay.
Right? Because we're not using it to answer a specific question. But let's say that we were to say, oh, right, we are running a study on whether learning rate from negative feedback differs in depression and non-psychiatric controls. Right? Part of the question might be, is there a group level difference? But another would be, well, we see extensive variability between the individuals. What determines the variability? Is that the severity of the depression? Is that whether they are on antidepressive and the dose of the antidepressive? Is it personality characteristics, right? What is... So in that sense, we're interested both in the population level and in the individual parameter level in that specific question. Yeah, but it really depends on your question. Again, are we interested in the variability of alpha within a class? It depends on your question, right? The general question that we used to ask when using those syntaxes, it didn't even allow us to condition sigma on something else, right? The error terms, the residuals of the model, they were what they were. There was one distribution of residuals after you fitted the model, and that was it. But here, nothing stops us from saying, actually, right, the variability in the class might depend on how strict a selection in terms of grades that was that year, right? So if there was everybody had to have 12.2 to get in, there might be a lower variability than if it was a less stringent selection or something like that, right? If it's a year with more international students, we might expect there to be more variability. But we don't know, and that's if the variability in a certain parameter is important for us to better plan teaching, then we could go and assess that. So what we're interested in could be anything here unobserved, and then we can always run questions on that. Is this clear? Yeah. See, still have some time. Okay, we can actually get to code. I'm going to go a bit fast on the R code because you've seen it a million times. Here, I'm just simulating at the same time a biased agent and a memory agent. And it's the same code that you've seen before. So we have a bunch of codes, a bunch of choices. Then we can simulate a bunch of participants that generate those choices, but we constrain their parameter values on an overall distribution. So we can say there's a bunch of agent. Here I'm saying 100 agent, 120 trials. There's a certain level of noise because otherwise things are too easy for our models. There's the bias agent parameters where the mean at the population level for the bias is 1.386, which is about 0.8, 80% probability of picking right over left. And for the memory and rate SD, sorry, of 0.65, which I was playing with, and it gives us about a standard deviation of 0.1 in probability scale, very roughly, because, you know, it's not a one-on-one mapping. It's not a linear mapping. And then we do something very similar in terms of the memory agent parameters. We define them at the population level. Then what we do is that we loop through as many agents as we need. And for each agent, we extract the rate as a normal distribution with a mean of rate M and a standard deviation of rate SD. We do the same for the alpha, the beta, and then we just run the rest of the machinery using the specific parameter values that we sample. Does that make sense? So in this specific case, I'm not generating numerically myself the values for the agents because I'm assuming that they all come from the same underlying distribution. Then we plot them just to see that everything goes well. Then I look whether the memory agents are learning. So as the bias of the agent changes, how does the memory estimate of the memory agent changes accordingly? And we can see that the more biased the biased agent is, the more the memory agent has in its memory a bias, right? With 10, 60, and 120 correlations, 120 trials, we see that the estimates become more and more precise. So the model is somewhat working. I turned off. And we'll take a little bit. So, okay, I'm going to do it on the whiteboard while the people on Zoom can look on the slide. But the basic idea is that what we want to do now is we want to take the data and we want to transform them into stand data. You see in the course notes and in the slides when they come back up that I did something funny, which is instead of taking all the 120 trials for each participant, I actually, for each participant, I sample a random number, I think between 40 and 120, and that's the number of trials that are available from that participant. And we're a bit too early for you to know, to have been shown why that's the case, but try to take a guess. Why would we want in our simulation some participants that are with a lot of trials and some participants without, or with few trials? Yes?
Yes, you would expect that in an actual experiment.
Yep.
Some participants don't necessarily have all files of information.
Yes, this is in terms of like empirical adequacy. There is also another pedagogical point. So if you remember, and then this. If you remember, we are doing what we call partial pooling. That is, we are learning from the other participant about any individual participant. So if I vary the number of trials, suddenly I have a situation where there is informational asymmetry. Some participants have more information available, and therefore the population prior should have, the population parameter level should have less impact on them. If the participant has only 30 trials or 40, then that's relatively less data, less information compared to the others. So it should be more shaped by the parameter, right? It's a way of checking whether our model is doing what we built it to do. That is, shape the individuals according to all the other individuals or the population level prior. And to assess what it's doing, we can manipulate the level of information that there is for each participant, right? So that we see whether those participants that have less information are more shaped and moved by the others. Does that make sense? Right. So in order to do that, I look at how many trials there are in total. Then I have J is how many agents there are. And then I have a sequence that tells us for each trial. So let's say there's 3 trials for participant A and 5 trials for participant 3, 5 for participant B. Usually we would be trying to do a matrix, 3, 4, 5. We would have like a value here for A, a value here for A, and then we would have 5 values for B in the second column. And here we would have to do something. Stan doesn't like NAs, but we would have to have something like NAs there. So in order to avoid that issue with the NAs, what we do is we simply concatenate all the values that we actually have. And then we have a second vector that tells us A, B, 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 B. So basically, we reinvented the long format, right? Which allows us to have variable length by participant or stimulus or whatever we're interested in. And then we have, so N is how many data points there are, J, how many agents. Agent is the column that tells us for each data point which agent has produced it. And H is our choices, observed choices. So when we then move on to Stan, in the data chunk, we have exactly the same thing, right? We have an integer n, which lower possible value is 1, which tells us how many observations there are total. We have an integer j, which lowest possible value is 1, which tells us how many agents are producing those. And then we have an array of length n, in which there are integers. The lower possible value is 1. And the highest possible value is j, the number of agents that we have. And that's the column of agents. And then we have the array of length n, our integers, lower 0, upper 1, and that's the choices. Does that make sense? Good. Then we have our, well, this is our representation, which you have seen, right? We need to define the different layers that generate these data. The individual level layer, the population level layer, and then put priors on that. So as parameters, we have the mu theta and the sigma theta, the theta mean and the theta standard deviation, which are the population level parameters. And then we have the individual level parameters. So we create a vector of length j of theta logit, of the rates for the single individual. Is this clear, right? In the parameters, we're trying to estimate the population and the individuals. The population is defined by 2 parameters, the mean and how varied we expect the participants to be. The individuals are defined by 1 parameter, their theta, their propensity to pick right. Then we have the model, right? Let's start from here. Here we have that the theta logit, that is the individual level parameter, is generated according to a normal distribution with the population level mean as the mean and the population level sigma or variation as the sigma or variation. Right? We just put these into a distribution, right? And then we have that the actual choices are generated by the theta logic of that specific agent. Right? So these corresponds to this level, and these corresponds to this level. Then we have the priors, right? We have that for mu theta, and again, we're working on the logit level, right? So we don't need to worry too much about the boundaries. There is a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1.5, which we saw gives us basically the whole of the 0 to 1 distribution. And then as a sigma theta, the variability of the theta, we have a parameter that can only take positive values, right? Because you can only have a standard deviation, which is a positive or 0. So here I've been lazy, so I could have given it a normal distribution and then truncated, and then I need to explain truncation and etc. So I've been a bit lazy, and I gave it an exponential distribution with, confusing enough, I think this is called, well, let's call it lambda of 1, right? Which basically you can plot it, but it's going to be something like right, with a long tail. Yes.
It's just about the subscript of the last
Yes.
actual choice. It seems to me somehow that Stan knows something sometimes with these
Yes.
that's not explicit.
Yes. So usually what I would do when I start is to say for, let's call it A in 1 to J, so the agents. Right. We would have that, and then we would need to go for T in 1 to whatever the number of trials is in that specific agent. Say trials for the agent. And then we would say that there's a target, blah, blah, blah. And then we would have the specific choice at that specific. So for agent A, oh, it's actually the other way around. We would have the T comma A, right? And then we would calculate we would use the theta logit of A. So we can run through this. The good thing about Stan is that it's been devised exactly for this situation. And it says, actually, you don't need to run it one at a time, right? Because the underlying theta is unchanging, right? So we can feed all the data to the theta at the same time. It's not like in reinforcement learning, where the theta depends on the expected value of the previous trial corrected by the feedback that we just received. Right here, it's a latent parameter which doesn't change. So we can actually feed all of these at the same time. And then what is kind of neat, and I don't think it was possible a couple of years ago, is that now you can simply add the suffix here, agent, and it knows that it needs to separate the estimation at the boundary between agents. Right? It's taking all the trials for agent 1 and doing this, and then all the trials for agent 2 and then doing it. Right? And it's much more efficient than the loop. But it's the equivalent of doing this. The equivalent of going through a loop by agent, and within each agent of going through a loop by trial. Yes. Okay, then this is a perfect point to take a break.